Welcome to the Horace Mann League's podcast series. This program is dedicated to superintendents, professors of education, association leaders, and others who believe the common public school is the cornerstone of our community and our democracy. My name is Jean Collins DeWeese, Executive Director of the Horace Mann League. With me today is your host, Jimmy Minicello.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to our podcast. It's a pleasure to welcome our next guest to the Horace Mann League podcast series. She's a past president of the Horace Mann League and most recently the executive director of the Metropolitan Omaha Education Consortium. Before that, she served as superintendent of Iowa's Council Bluffs Community School and assistant superintendent of Millard Public Schools in Nebraska. She was also a department chair at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, as well as a classroom teacher and building principal, and served as a board member and president of ASCD. A very good friend of public education, let me welcome Martha Bruckner to the program. Martha, so nice to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I'm honored to be here.
Well, our theme for this program, this episode, is women in leadership. But before we get there, let me ask you about the Metropolitan Omaha Education Consortium. What's it all about and its mission?
I'm happy to tell you, Jimmy, because it's probably pretty unique in our country, actually. The Metropolitan Omaha Education Consortium, nicknamed MOEC, started in 1988 as a collection of 5 school districts and the University of Nebraska Omaha College of Education, trying to find ways to work together to improve education throughout our entire metropolitan area. We do not have one city school district or one county school district. We actually have a lot of school districts. Over 30 years, we added more and more school districts to the point that it now has 12 school districts, 2 community colleges, in addition to the University of Nebraska Omaha and their teacher education program. So it really is kind of an amazing opportunity for superintendents to come together monthly, for various work groups to come together to talk about teacher recruitment, student behavior, just to share best practices with each other so that we're not hiding them from each other, but that we're encouraging each school district to do the best possible job to meet the needs of their students.
And I would imagine, Martha, in addition to some of the issues you raised that are so important for any school district in any state across the country, I'm sure the networking among all of the professionals there was very beneficial to everyone involved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had superintendents who had been in their position for more than 20 years and superintendents that were just beginning their work. And I think it was a very good way to learn at any stage in your career, to learn from others, and also to make it kind of a more friendly, collaborative situation. The opportunity to collaborate in MOEC is extremely important, whether one has been a superintendent for 20 some years or a superintendent for months. The ability to come together regularly to talk about issues that are being addressed in every district is invaluable. It's like free college courses for people to learn from each other.
As my colleague and very dear friend Mort Sherman would say, it sounds as though everyone was a critical friend to the other.
That is absolutely true. Sometimes we were more critical and sometimes we were more friend, but I think it's a good terminology.
Well, let's get to the theme of this episode, women in leadership. First, could you share your definition, according to Martha Bruckner, quality leadership, and explain what that concept means to you in practice?
I'd be happy to try to do that. I'm going to borrow the concept of servant leadership. I don't think that was something that I heard of early on in my career. But quality leadership is really finding a way or finding ways to coalesce a group of people to work together effectively and efficiently to meet the goals of the organization. It's really important to know that leadership is not a one-person gig. It's important to have a group move together in a positive direction. And I think the leader, that's one of his or her main jobs, is to make it be about us rather than make it be about me.
Were you ever in a situation where you saw that, where it was about me?
I think we've all been in situations, both in our professional life and in our personal life, where we have encountered people, sometimes leaders, who were more interested in what happened to or for the leader rather than what happened to or for the organization. We all run into them, and we all have to find a way to get around them.
Talk about a pivotal moment, please, that you may have experienced that influenced or sparked your own leadership journey, and what inspired or motivated you to pursue a leadership path.
I hope it's not as true now as it was 40 years ago, that women had to be invited into school leadership. I heard that quite often when I was a younger educator, that women often in the old days didn't see themselves as much as a leader as men did. I can very visibly recall the first time I ever saw myself in a position that others would recognize, and that was, I actually was the department head in an English department in my high school, and I got called to the superintendent's office, and I couldn't imagine why. So I went down and talked to him, and he explained to me that there was an elementary principal job opened, and the person retiring had been a female, and they had not yet found a female to take the position. And so he was recommending me. And I was amazed, aghast, because I honestly knew very little about elementary education. It was even before I had kids. So my elementary education was years before. But the idea grew on me as he gave me a weekend to think about it. And I started thinking about, going out to the playground with the little kids and being a beloved principal in an elementary school. And I went to the board meeting the next Monday because that's when I was supposed to give a report about something in my department. And lo and behold, he told the board that the new principal for this elementary school was in the room. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I didn't say I'd take it. And he introduced somebody entirely different that they had discovered over the course of the weekend without ever telling me or anything. So my first introduction to thinking about being a school leader was a little rocky, but it also kind of encouraged me to think about going back and getting some administrative courses under my belt in case an opportunity ever came up again.
I was going to ask, what did you learn from that experience?
Well, first of all, I learned that's not the way to fill a position. That was unkind to me and to the thought process that I'd put into it over the previous several days. But I also learned that maybe I did want to be a school leader, which is not necessarily something that I didn't let myself ponder before.
So something perhaps, and I'm imagining here, trying to look at the bright side, that something that was sad turned out to be a benefit for your professional growth.
It absolutely did. It was. I was not in a position to go into a school where all of the teachers knew so much more about their curriculum and their practices than I did. It wasn't going to be a good idea. So it worked out very much for the better. And I realized that. I got over it very quickly. But it did kind of put the idea in my mind that maybe I could be a school leader.
And that's a perfect segue to our next question, which is, when in your career did you say to yourself or realize, yes, I am truly a leader now?
Well, I don't want all of my stories to sound as dramatic as they do so far, because they weren't. But the situation comes to mind, and I've told the story before, and people ask me to go back and tell it again. It must be interesting.
I'm sure it is.
I was a superintendent in my first 6 weeks in a district that was really having some difficulties with keeping students. Our enrollment was declining. And in succeeding with students, our graduation rate was extremely low. In this particular meeting of my executive cabinet, in my office, around a very small table there were 7 of us, I made a comment about a recent story in the local newspaper that our enrollment had once again declined. It was right after the official count came out from the state, and our enrollment was down. This is my first year. And so the enrollment from the previous year to my first year had decreased. And I said to my team, our team, oh my gosh, we can't keep this happening. What can we do to convince our parents and our community that this is a good place to send your kids? We can't keep going on like this, because state funding is tied to the number of students you have. We definitely need state funding in order to meet the needs of our challenging population. But as we lose more of them, it becomes more and more difficult. And one of my colleagues, who had been in the district for quite some time, shook her head and said to me, Martha, don't forget this is school district name. And that's just how it is. It is what it is. And I think I paused for 10 or 15 seconds and then honestly banged my fist as hard as I could on the table and said, could you just let me pretend that there's something we could do to make it better? Let's just pretend we could change this. And I was not pleased. And in walks the administrative assistant who had been in the district for 40 years and had mentored 7 superintendents before me. And she said to me, oh my gosh, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I laughed and said, it's okay, Karen. We're just having a little discussion. It'll all be fine. And so she closed the door and walked away. And I thought to myself, well, I just have thrown myself out there in front of this executive cabinet team. Let's see if we can make it work. It's pretty memorable for me. And we did work on it, and we did make some really good changes.
It sounds as though everyone stood up or sat back and took notice.
I think that's probably true. It was not part of my persona that they had ever seen before.
When we spoke about this episode a couple of weeks ago, you told me that you did not envision yourself becoming a superintendent. Can you share what shifted your career trajectory and led you to pursue a leadership role in school system administration?
Jimmy, that is entirely true. There was nothing that I saw in the role of superintendent that looked too appealing to me. When I worked on my doctorate, my beloved advisor and many of my colleagues, students said, you might as well get your superintendent's endorsement along the way. And I said, I'm never going to use it. Why would I do that? And they just said, it makes sense. It's not that much harder. Take the extra courses, get certified. And so I did, but it didn't make me think someday I'm going to be a superintendent. The first time that occurred to me, I was serving in a role as associate superintendent. And I thought I had some pretty good ideas. I really did, humble as they might be. And I would share them with the superintendent. And I didn't feel like I was always listened to as much as I wanted to. And I didn't feel that my ideas were always really considered. So it was about 4.5 years into working in that district in an associate role that I went to the superintendent. Oh, and I know exactly what the decision was that he made that I disagreed with. And I went to him with all due respect and said, do you think I could be a superintendent? And he said, oh, you don't like being second in charge. And honestly, that was the first time I really thought he ever considered me second in charge. So from there, I applied for a couple of superintendencies, became a finalist, and was blessed to be named superintendent in a school district that was nearby to where I lived.
You said earlier, Martha, you didn't think you were listened to. For our listeners, no pun intended, some of them may feel that they may not be listened to in their communities or their places of work. And if that happens, what is a good way to go about working with your team or a teammate so you can become someone who is listened to?
That's a good question. As I think back on it, there were only a couple of times in that particular position when I actually tried to talk to my leader about my feelings. One was when my superintendent would go to superintendent conferences, he would take some other members of the cabinet with him. I was never invited. I went in to him once and said, I noticed you take, Bill and Jim to conferences. I think it would be good for me to do that someday. And he said, well, I'll think about it. And he didn't ever have that happen, but at least I had kind of spoken up about it. The final decision for me was when our district was picking a leader that was going to work in my department. And I felt very strongly that it should be person one. And the superintendent believed it should be person two. And he picked person two. And I again went into him and said, you're not listening to me. I'm the one that's going to be working with this person. And there were some other extenuating circumstances why I thought person one would be better. But he said to me, Martha, I have confidence that you can work with anybody. And that was a nice thing for him to say. But I decided at that point that I needed to maybe look at some other position in which I wasn't expected to just deal with decisions that other people made, that I could perhaps be more involved in making decisions that I felt were important.
We all know Andy Forlis. She's the superintendent of Arizona's Mesa Public Schools. She recently shared on this program how actionable feedback transformed her practice. How has receiving actionable feedback for you impact your leadership? And can you provide an example of how it shaped your professional growth?
The whole idea that I didn't really ever see myself as a leader, but people kept inviting me to different positions. That's pretty actionable feedback. I don't know if it was lack of confidence or whatever, but as I look back on positions from teacher to assistant principal to university professor to associate superintendent, in each one of those, someone first invited me and I responded. Their invitation was in some ways feedback about what they thought I could do. Another example that comes to mind was in the district in which I was superintendent. I found a need for us to come together better as a team, our team of administrative leaders. And the actionable feedback that I received was people on this administrative team coming to me and telling me that another administrator or another leader had not done the appropriate thing, or another administrator had not involved the right people, I was kind of being told too often that my team wasn't working as well as they should as a team. And after thinking about what can we do about that, I involved that entire team in a process, probably my third or fourth year out of my tenure, to create norms that we would operate under. That included no anonymity. And it also included, if I have a problem with another one of my colleagues, instead of going to the superintendent to share it, I go to the colleague and say, hey, Jack, this doesn't seem to be working. Can we talk about it? And one of our norms was you had to have that face-to-face conversation before you came to the superintendent, because I didn't want to be seen as the problem solver or the judge of every single topic. So I think what I took was the feedback that was not directly feedback, but was an ongoing situation to make me take an action that was, in the long run, very good for that organization, and actually followed through to my work in MOAC, where one of the first things I did with those principals those superintendents and college leaders was to have us together develop what our norms would be. And I, thereafter, anytime I shared a report, pointed to the norm that we were practicing. That's kind of my most favorite example of that.
Do you ever look back on those days, not that they were very far away, but do you ever look back at that time and ask yourself or say to yourself, I probably could have done it better this way or that way?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I had one interaction with a school board member that I continually think back on and think I could have done better at that. It all came out fine. He and I came out in agreement. I kind of got my way, but there were so many better ways that I could have handled it. In fact, the president of the school board, my first term as superintendent, said often to me and at meetings, sometimes it's not as important what we do as how we do it. And oh my gosh, he was so smart, because I have reminded myself and other groups of that frequently since then.
And by looking back, as you just reflected on, is that a good thing or a not so good thing? I think it's a good thing.
I agree with you. I think it's a good thing. It's, my goodness, we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. We all do things less perfectly than we wish we would. So yeah, I think it's important to look back and think about what could I have done differently. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that. I serve on a community board now, and I just wrote a note to the whole board in which I acknowledged that I made a mistake. I pointed out that the person I had corrected had in fact been the correct person. And I got very positive response from that, not because I was changing my decision, but because I acknowledged I could have done it better.
What needs to happen, Martha, in order to encourage more women to seek and attain administrative positions in public education?
I think it's happening. I mean, I know from my work at the university in educational leadership, the number of female candidates for administrative positions grew dramatically in the time that I worked in that position. So I think it's happening. I think it's important for both men and women to see women as potential leaders. We need to encourage women to be the best they can be, but I also think it's very, very valuable for women and men to have worked in multiple educational positions before they go after a leadership position. I vividly remember a first-year teacher who came into my room as a principal. I was talking with him about various things in his work, and he said, you know what I really want to do? He was going back for his master's degree in educational leadership. And I said, you know, it's important to spend some time in the classroom. I really believe spending some time in the classroom rather than jumping from teacher to principal in 3 years is a good decision. And he looked at me and said, no, I think I'm ready to work less and get the big bucks. And I thought, oh my gosh, you are so naive. He didn't listen to me. I don't know if anybody will listen to me. I think your experience in other roles prepares you to be a good leader and to have others that you work with see you as a good leader.
And I would imagine it has an impact on students as well. If a female student sees a female leader,
absolutely,
it may inspire her. Hey, I can
absolutely.
do that, or I can try to attain that position like that.
And my first story about being invited to be an elementary principal for a long time, when we would allow women to be in leadership positions, they were in the role of elementary. I was the first female high school principal in the state of Nebraska. And interestingly, when I became superintendent in my Iowa district, the headline the next day was not, wonderful leaders selected. The headline was first female superintendent selected. And I thought, oh gosh, I hope we can get past that to the point that we are seen as leaders, not necessarily as women leaders.
Yes, absolutely. Talk about, Martha, the importance of mentorship in leadership development for both women and men, and share how that has impacted your own career.
I didn't see myself as a leader until a superintendent invited me into that role. I didn't see myself working in the university until a college professor invited me into that role. I see the college professor as a mentor. I actually, when I was in high school, wrote an essay about my favorite teacher, and she was a teacher, elementary principal when I was in 8th grade. And maybe that's where it all started, when I saw her do an important role in education, and yet care very much about me and care very much about my fellow students. Maybe that was something deep seated in my past, she was a role model, a mentor for me.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, but we have time for one more question. And that is, what are one or two women leaders you admire today, whether they're in education or another field, and what qualities do you most respect about them?
I think back to my early undergraduate days. There was a university professor. I don't know that I had her as a teacher, but I recall her caring, her firm belief in doing the right thing. She came from New York. I was in Nebraska, and she made the comment about, well, she didn't use the word Nebraska nice, but she said, people in the Midwest are so afraid of disagreeing with each other. And that didn't stick with me very much, but I still remember it to this day. Those are the kind of leaders that are good. I have so many people, not so many, but I do have people that come up to me every once in a while and say, oh, you were my old principal, or you were something. And I say, no, I wasn't your old principal. I was your former principal. I'm not old. The way you treat people in any role really affects them from that point forward. And everyone in education has individual stories you can tell, where in the back of your mind, you think, if I hadn't done X, Y, and Z, this person would not be the person that he or she is right now. And that gives you some comfort. And hopefully we are mentored and we can continue to mentor others.
Fantastic. Actually, I lied. I have one more question, and that is, can you provide some outgoing thoughts or a suggestion to the women leaders listening to help them climb career ladders?
I think about advice that I gave students when I was working with graduate students at the university. I said on more than one occasion, don't let anybody push you into doing something wrong in order to get a position or to climb a ladder. Having your own integrity and doing the right thing, even if it means you don't get a certain job, is the best long-range plan for anybody. I also said to several people, don't be afraid to quit a job that isn't right for you. I would run into teachers and some administrators who were in a position they just could not stand, but they didn't want to leave because they were on the trajectory in order to get a retirement, in 15 years. And I'd say, oh my gosh, do not do something that you don't feel is rewarding or that you feel is helpful to you or is letting you use your talents. Don't do that for a long period of time just because you're afraid to move on or because ultimately you're going to get a pension if you stick it out long enough. That's not a way to live. You end up living longer, but not being very happy with the outcome.
I could not agree more. Well, Martha Bruckner, it was such a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you so much for appearing on the program.
Jimmy, thank you. You are doing such a wonderful service for Horace Mann League, which is by itself important because it stands up for public education, but you have kind of helped push us in a really good direction, and I and many others on HML really appreciate you.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and a special thanks to the Horace Mann League for hosting our podcast series. But most of all, thank you for listening to the program. Have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to the Horace Mann League podcast series. Our members are committed to Mann's ideal that the public school is one of the central unifying influences in American life. All of our podcasts are listed on YouTube, as well as the Horace Mann League website, hmleague.org. We also invite you to join the conversation through social media by accessing #HMannLeague. Once again, thank you for listening.